The stranger stood in the center of the church with twin colts strapped to his hips, and every man in Pebble Creek went silent. This was the same man they had laughed at, the same man a boy had thrown stones at, the same man they called Spineless. Now his voice cut through the room like a blade. "They took her," he said, "a 9-year-old girl, ripped from her mother's arms while you sat in your homes and did nothing." His eyes swept the room, cold, furious, alive. "Every one of you has lost something to these men. Cattle, money, your dignity, and you let them take it because you were afraid." He stepped forward. "But tonight, they took a child, and I'm asking you, as men, as fathers, are you going to sit in these pews and let them keep her?" Nobody breathed. The man standing before them was not the starving vagrant who had crawled into their town weeks ago. Something had awakened, and the fury in his eyes told them this man had been someone else entirely before he ever set foot in their valley. His name was Elias Cade. Not a single soul in that room knew what that name meant, not yet. But before this night was over, they would. And nothing in Pebble Creek would ever be the same. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the day this broken stranger stumbled into town with nothing but dust on his boots and a past he was trying to bury. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The Harwick Ranch sat at the edge of the valley where the grass turned gold in autumn and the wind never fully stopped blowing. It was not a grand spread. The barn leaned slightly to the east, its wood silver with age. The fences needed mending in 3 places. The chicken coop had a hole Lenora kept meaning to patch. But the land was honest. The creek ran year-round, and 40 head of cattle grazed the pastures alongside a dozen horses that Lenora had raised from foals. She had held this ranch together with blistered hands and sheer willpower since the day they lowered her husband Thomas into the ground. Nobody in town had offered to help. Some had offered to buy the land. She had refused every one of them. This ranch was the only thing she had left of the man she loved, and she would sooner burn it than sell it. When the wagon rolled up the dirt path, Elias Cade barely had the strength to climb down. Lenora pointed him toward the water trough by the barn. He washed his face and hands in silence, the water turning brown as the dust and grime peeled away. She brought him a plate of cold biscuits, a strip of dried beef, and a tin cup of water. He ate slowly, not because he wanted to savor it, but because his stomach had shrunk from weeks of hunger and anything faster would come back up. Bertie sat on the fence rail, swinging her boots, watching him with the kind of open fascination only children possess. "You eat like our barn cat," she said. Lenora shot her a look, but Elias almost smiled. "Your barn cat's got good instincts," he said quietly. Bertie grinned. It was the first time Elias had seen something that looked like light since Sarah died. That evening, Lenora sat on the porch while Bertie slept inside. Elias sat on the bottom step, his back against the railing, staring at the darkening sky. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had both learned that words cost something and should not be spent carelessly. "You running from the law?" Lenora asked, direct as a rifle shot. "No." "You running from yourself?" He paused. "Maybe," she nodded. "I've got work that needs doing. Fences, stock, firewood. I cannot pay much. A bed in the barn, meals, and $1 a week. You steal from me, and I will shoot you myself." He looked at her. "I do not steal." "Good. Then we understand each other." She stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, and went inside without another word. Elias lay in the barn that night on a bed of straw and old blankets. The horses shifted softly in their stalls. The wind whispered through the gaps in the walls. He stared at the rafters and let the silence press against him like a weight he had carried for so long he no longer noticed it. He thought of Sarah. The way she laughed in the morning before her eyes were fully open, the way she hummed while she kneaded bread, the way she said his name like it was something precious. The riders had come at dusk, 6 men on black horses. They burned the house, the barn, the fences. They did it because Elias had killed their leader's brother in a gunfight 3 months earlier. A fair fight, a legal kill, but revenge does not care about legality. He closed his eyes. His hands, the same hands that had once drawn iron faster than lightning, lay flat and still against the straw. He had thrown those guns into the Redwater River and watched them sink. He had sworn he would never pick up a weapon again, because every bullet he had ever fired had eventually circled back and taken something from him. He told himself he was done. He told himself he was just a man now. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and the hunger and the silence, the thing he used to be still breathed. And in the weeks to come, Pebble Creek would learn what happened when a man like Elias Cade was pushed past the edge of what he could endure. Elias woke before dawn. It was not discipline that pulled him from sleep, but habit, the kind forged by years of sleeping with one eye open in country that did not forgive carelessness. He pulled on his boots, splashed water on his face from the trough, and walked the fence line before the sun cracked the horizon. 3 posts had rotted through. A section near the creek had collapsed entirely, and the cattle had already begun drifting toward the gap. He found tools in the barn, rusted but usable, and by the time Lenora stepped onto the porch with coffee in her hands, the first post was already set and packed tight with fresh earth. She watched him work without speaking. His movements were slow, careful, methodical. Not the rushed effort of a man trying to impress, but the quiet rhythm of someone who understood that good work required patience. By the 3rd day, the fence line was repaired. By the 5th, he had patched the barn roof, cleared the coop, and stacked enough firewood to last a month. Lenora watched him the way she watched a horse she could not yet read. His hands were steady despite his thinness. His eyes noticed things. He spotted a sick calf before she did, isolated it, and treated the infection with a poultice made from creek mud and sage. "Where'd you learn that?" she asked, standing over the calf as it breathed easier. "A long time ago," he said. "Another life." She did not press. There was something about him that discouraged questions, not with hostility, but with a quietness so deep it felt rude to disturb it. He worked hard. He spoke little. He ate whatever she put in front of him and never asked for more. He slept in the barn and never came inside unless invited. Bertie, however, had no such reservations. She followed Elias around the ranch like a shadow with braids. She asked him questions the way rivers flow, constant and without apology. "Do you know how to ride?" "Yes." "Do you know how to rope?" "Yes." "Can you whistle with 2 fingers?" He showed her. She clapped and demanded he teach her immediately. Elias found himself kneeling in the dirt, holding the child's small fingers in position while she blew air without sound, over and over, laughing each time she failed. Something cracked inside him during those moments, something old and buried. He had never had a child of his own. Sarah had wanted one desperately. They had talked about names, about building a bigger house, about the kind of parents they would be. Then the riders came, and the future they planned turned to smoke. One afternoon, Bertie brought him a drawing she had made on brown paper with charcoal. It showed 3 figures standing in front of a house, a tall one, a medium one, and a small one. "That's you," she said, pointing to the tallest figure. "That's Mama, and that's me." Elias stared at the drawing for a long time. His throat tightened, his hands trembled. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his shirt pocket close to his chest. "That's the finest drawing I've ever seen," he said. Bertie beamed. Lenora watched this exchange from the kitchen window, her hand still in dishwater. She did not smile, but something in her chest shifted, the way ice shifts on a river just before the thaw. But the town had not forgotten the stranger. When Lenora rode in for supplies the following week, the whispers followed her like dust behind a wagon. Old Jasper, at the feed store, leaned across the counter. "You know people are talking, Lenora. A strange man living on your property, no name, no past, no people. That's not safe for a woman alone with a child." Lenora met his stare without blinking. "He works harder than any man in this town, and he has more manners than most of them, too." Jasper shook his head. "I'm just saying, a man with no past usually has a past worth hiding." She paid for her goods and left. But as she loaded the wagon, a man she did not recognize stood across the street watching her. His hat was pulled low, his coat was long, and on his hip sat a gun with a handle carved from bone. He watched her ride out of town and did not look away until the dust swallowed her whole. Weeks turned. The ranch began to breathe again under Elias's hands. The fences stood straight. The cattle were healthy. The horses, once skittish and neglected, now answered his whistle. He had a way with animals that Lenora had not seen before. He did not command them. He moved among them like he spoke their language, slow, patient, present. Birdie named the youngest foal Biscuit and insisted Elias was the only one allowed to feed it. "Biscuit only likes you," she declared with the absolute authority of a 9-year-old. Elias looked at the foal, which was currently chewing on his sleeve. "Biscuit likes anyone with pockets," he said. Birdie laughed so hard she fell off the fence. Lenora, who had been watching from the barn door with a halter in her hands, turned away quickly so neither of them would see the smile breaking across her face. The evenings became something neither of them named. After Birdie went to bed, Lenora would sit on the porch with coffee, and Elias would sit on the lower step. They talked about the ranch mostly, what needed fixing, what the weather might do, how the creek rose when the mountain snow melted. But slowly, the way rivers carve stone without anyone noticing, the conversations deepened. Lenora told him about Thomas, how he'd been a quiet man, not clever, not ambitious, but steady. How he had built the porch they sat on with his own hands the summer Birdie was born. How the horse that killed him had been his favorite. He always said that horse had a wild heart, she said, her voice steady but thin. He was right. Elias listened without interruption. He understood that grief did not need fixing. It needed witnessing. One night, after the fire had died low and the stars pressed close, Lenora asked the question she had been holding for weeks. "Who were you before?" Elias was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the grass like something breathing. "I was a man who solved problems with a gun," he said, "and I was good at it, better than anyone had a right to be." He paused. "I had a wife. Her name was Sarah. She was the only person in the world who ever made me want to be something other than what I was." His voice did not break, but it bent. "They came for me, found her. Instead." Lenora did not speak. She reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. Her palm was rough from work, warm from the coffee she'd been holding. He did not pull away. They sat like that for a long time, two people who had both lost the person they built their life around, holding steady in the dark. But Lenora carried a secret worry that kept her awake long after these evenings ended. It was about Birdie. The girl had attached herself to Elias with the fierce, unguarded love that only a fatherless child can offer. She saved him the best biscuit at breakfast. She drew pictures for him every day. She told him stories about school, about her friends, about the owl that lived in the barn rafters. And Elias, despite every wall he had built around his heart, responded. He listened to her stories with full attention. He carved her a small wooden horse from a piece of oak. He taught her to read animal tracks in the mud. Lenora saw what was happening, and it terrified her. Not because she feared Elias would hurt Birdie. She feared he would leave. Every man she had ever relied on had been taken from her. Her father, her husband. If Birdie formed a bond this deep and Elias vanished, the girl would break in a way that could not be mended with time or tenderness. So Lenora kept a careful distance. She allowed the warmth between them, but never let it become official. She never called him family. She never spoke of the future in terms that included him. And at night, when she lay in bed listening to the wind, she wondered whether protecting her daughter from loss meant denying her the one thing she needed most, a father who chose to stay. The name Decker Flint moved through the countryside the way fever moves through a body, slow at first, then everywhere at once. He was not a bandit in the way dime novels described. He did not rob stagecoaches or hold up banks with dramatic flair. Decker Flint was something worse. He was methodical. He rode into small communities with a dozen armed men, identified what people valued most, and took it. Cattle, horses, savings hidden beneath floorboards. And when people resisted, he took something else, their children. He held them for ransom in a canyon hideout 60 miles east, a place so deep in the Badlands that no sheriff had ever found it. He had terrorized the region for 3 years. 4 communities had been bled dry, 2 families had lost children they never saw again because they could not pay. The people of Pebble Creek knew the name. They had heard stories from travelers from neighboring settlements, but they believed distance protected them. They believed Decker Flint had no reason to ride this far west. They were wrong. When the first ranch on the outskirts was hit, a family named Coulter, who lost 20 head of cattle and every dollar they had buried under the hearth, the town held a meeting. Men stood in the church with their hats in their hands and their voices full of fear disguised as anger. "We need to fight," old Jasper said. "We need to ride out and meet them." But nobody volunteered. Nobody saddled a horse, because fighting meant dying, and every man in that room had something to lose. Elias sat in the back of the church during that meeting. Lenora had asked him to come. He listened to every word but said nothing. Afterward, as they walked to the wagon, Lenora looked at him. "You recognize the name?" It was not a question. Elias nodded slowly. "Decker Flint ran with a crew out of Redwater Territory," he said. "They were hired guns, mercenaries. Then Decker decided he liked being the one who gave orders." Lenora stopped walking. "Do you know him?" Elias's jaw tightened. "His brother was the one who sent riders to my homestead." The air between them changed. Lenora stared at him, her eyes searching for something beneath the surface. "You killed his brother." "I killed a man who drew on me in a saloon," Elias corrected. "The law called it justified. His family called it war." They rode home in silence that stretched tighter than barbed wire. That night, Elias did not sit on the porch. He stood at the fence line, staring east, his arms crossed over his chest. The wind carried the smell of sage and dust. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridges and the dry creeks and the miles of empty land, Decker Flint was moving closer. Elias could feel it, the way an old wound aches before a storm. He had spent months trying to become invisible, trying to be nobody. But history had a way of finding men who tried to hide from it, and Decker Flint was not the kind of man who forgot. Inside the cabin, Bertie slept with the wooden horse Elias had carved tucked beneath her arm. Lenora stood at the window, watching Elias in the moonlight. She saw the way his shoulders had changed, the way his stillness was no longer the stillness of a broken man, but the stillness of something coiled. She did not know the full weight of what he had been, but she knew, with the instinct of a woman who had survived on her own, that the man standing at her fence line was not the same man who had knelt in the dirt of Pebble Creek weeks ago. Something in him was waking up, and she was not sure whether to be grateful or afraid. Spring settled over the valley like a held breath finally released. The creek ran high with snowmelt. The pastures turned emerald. Wildflowers pushed through the hard earth in bursts of yellow and purple that Bertie picked by the fistful and arranged in jars on the kitchen table. The ranch had never looked this alive, not even when Thomas was living. Elias had rebuilt the corral, trained 2 of the younger horses to saddle, and cleared a patch of land near the house where Lenora planted a vegetable garden for the first time in years. They worked side by side most days. Their rhythms matched the way 2 instruments tuned to each other without being told. He anticipated her needs before she spoke them. She left his coffee on the fence post each morning before he asked. Neither of them acknowledged what was building between them, but both of them felt it. One evening, after a long day of branding calves, they sat on the porch while the sunset bled crimson across the sky. Bertie had fallen asleep on the floor inside, her charcoal-stained fingers still curled around a drawing. Lenora's hair had come loose from its braid, and strands of it caught the wind. She looked exhausted and beautiful in the way that only real earned weariness can be. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, not accusingly, just honestly. Elias looked at his hands. "Every day," she flinched, though she tried to hide it. "But I don't want to," he added quietly. "Wanting to leave and wanting to stay can live in the same chest. I've just been giving the staying part more room." She turned to him then. The light caught her eyes, and he saw something there he had not seen in months. Not pity, not caution, warmth. "Bertie asked me something yesterday," Lenora said. "She asked if you were going to be her new papa." Elias went still. The words struck him like a stone thrown from a place he thought he had walled off. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that people don't become family just because you want them to. They become family when they choose to stay through the hard parts. She paused. She said you already had. The wind stirred the wildflowers. A horse nickered softly in the corral. Elias felt something crack inside his chest, not painfully, but the way frozen ground cracks when warmth finally reaches deep enough. He wanted to tell Lenora that Bertie's drawing was still in his pocket, that he had not gone a single day without touching it, that the child's laughter had become the only sound in the world that made silence feel safe. But he held back, not because he did not feel it, but because he knew what he had been. He knew that the name Elias Cade was written in blood across half the territories. Knew that somewhere Decker Flint was still breathing, still moving, still carrying a grudge as old as the grave his brother lay in. And he knew that loving someone meant making them a target. Sarah had taught him that. So he said nothing more. He stood, tipped his hat slightly, and walked to the barn. Lenora watched him go, her hand pressed against her chest as if holding something in place. She did not follow. She understood walls. She had built enough of her own. But that night, as Elias lay on his straw bed staring at the barn ceiling, he heard small footsteps outside the door. Then a knock, light and tentative. He opened it. Bertie stood in the moonlight, barefoot, clutching her blanket. "I had a bad dream," she whispered. "Can I sit with you?" He looked at the child. Her eyes were wide and trusting, her hair tangled from sleep. She looked so small against the dark. He knelt down, wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and carried her to the rocking chair Lenora kept in the corner of the barn. He sat with her on his lap and rocked slowly until her breathing evened out and her head grew heavy against his chest. He did not sleep. He held her. And in the holding, something inside him decided, quietly and without ceremony, that this child was worth more than every bullet he had ever fired. The trouble came on a Tuesday. Elias had ridden out before dawn to check on a section of fence near the north ridge where coyotes had been circling the herd. He took nothing but a canteen and a length of rope, no gun, no blade. He had promised himself that much. The ride was long and the morning cold, and by the time he reached the ridge, the sun was climbing, and the wind carried the bitter smell of turned earth. He found the broken section, repaired it, and sat for a while on a flat rock overlooking the valley. From there, he could see the Harwick Ranch in the distance, small and still, smoke curling from the chimney. He could see the road that led to town. He could see the shapes of cattle dotting the pasture. What he could not see, because the ridge blocked his view to the east, were the riders. 12 men rode into Pebble Creek that morning like a storm front crossing flat land. They moved in a tight column, their horses dark and lathered, their coats long and weather-stained. At their head rode Decker Flint. He was tall and lean with a jaw like an anvil and eyes so pale they looked almost white in the sun. A scar ran from his right temple to the corner of his mouth, pulling his face into a permanent half-sneer. He wore twin revolvers on his hips and a rifle across his back, and he moved with the lazy confidence of a man who had never once been told no. The town froze when they appeared. Shutters closed. Women pulled children inside. The street emptied as if the wind itself had swept it clean. Decker dismounted outside the saloon and walked into the general store where old Jasper stood behind the counter, his hands trembling against the wood. "I'm looking for something," Decker said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "This valley has been real generous to my boys lately, but generosity runs out." He leaned on the counter. "I need money. I need horses. And I need people to understand that this is not a request." Jasper stammered something about the sheriff. Decker laughed, a sound like gravel sliding. "The sheriff is in Laramie. He won't be back for a month, and even if he was here, he would not be enough." Decker's men moved through the town like water through cracks, taking what they wanted, loading saddlebags with goods and coins. But Decker was not finished. He had learned from travelers about a widow's ranch at the edge of the valley, a ranch with fine horses and a woman running it alone. He sent 4 men east along the road while the rest held the town. The 4 riders reached the Harwick Ranch just after noon. Lenora was in the barn when she heard the hooves. She stepped outside and saw them, 4 strangers on dark. Horses, their faces hard beneath their hats. "Where's your man?" the lead rider asked. "I have no man," Lenora answered, her chin lifting. The rider smiled. "Then this will be easy. They took the horses from the corral. They took the strongbox from beneath the floorboard in the kitchen. And when Bertie ran outside screaming for her mother, the lead rider grabbed her by the arm and lifted her onto his horse like she weighed nothing at all. Lenora screamed. She lunged forward, but another rider struck her across the face with the back of his hand and sent her crashing into the dirt. "Your girl stays with us," the lead rider said. $500 by the end of the week. You bring it to the old mining camp at Eagle Pass. You bring the law, she dies. You bring anyone, she dies. You don't pay, she dies. They rode east with Bertie's cries carrying across the valley like something torn from the sky itself. Lenora lay in the dirt, blood on her lip, dust in her hair, and the sound of her daughter's voice fading into distance. She had never felt a pain like this. Not when Thomas died, not when her father left. This was something beyond grief. This was the kind of pain that either destroys a person or turns them into something the world has never seen. Elias came back to the ranch at dusk. He knew something was wrong before he even crossed the creek. The corral was empty. The gate hung open on broken hinges. No smoke rose from the chimney. The silence was the wrong kind of silence, not peaceful, but abandoned. He kicked the horse into a gallop and reached the house in seconds. Lenora sat on the porch steps, her dress torn at the shoulder, dried blood on the corner of her mouth. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but dry now, empty in a way that frightened him more than tears would have. He dropped from the saddle and knelt before her. "What happened?" she told him. Every word came out flat and measured, as if she were reciting something carved into stone. 4 riders. Decker Flint's men. They took the horses. They took the money. They took Bertie. Elias felt the words hit him like bullets. Each one struck a different place inside his chest. Bertie, the child who drew pictures with charcoal, the child who named a foal biscuit and laughed when it chewed his sleeve, the child who had knocked on the barn door with a blanket around her shoulders and trusted him to keep the nightmares away. They had taken her. His hands began to shake, not from fear, but from something older and deeper, something he had buried in the riverbed with his guns, something that had been sleeping for months beneath the quiet of ranch work and porch conversations and a little girl's laughter. It woke up now, all of it, at once. He stood, his spine straightened, his shoulders squared. The tremor left his hands and was replaced by a stillness so absolute it changed the air around him. Lenora looked up and saw something she had never seen before. The man standing in front of her was not the starving vagrant who had knelt in the dirt. He was not the quiet ranch hand who fixed fences and carved wooden horses. This was someone else entirely. Someone whose eyes had gone cold and sharp as polished steel. Someone whose very posture said that the world was about to learn a lesson it would not forget. "How many?" he asked. His voice was different now, lower, controlled, like a blade being drawn from its sheath. 4 came here, Lenora said, but there are more in town, a dozen maybe. Elias walked to the barn. Beneath the floorboards, buried under straw and dust, was a leather bundle he had hidden the day he arrived. He had told himself he would never touch it again. He had promised Sarah's memory that the guns were gone, but Sarah was dead, and the guns were not at the bottom of the Redwater River. He had lied to himself about that. He had carried them every mile of his journey, unable to let go of the last pieces of who he used to be. He unwrapped the leather. Inside lay twin Colt revolvers with walnut grips, oiled and gleaming despite their confinement, a gun belt worn smooth by years of use, and a box of .44 caliber cartridges. He strapped the belt on. The weight settled against his hips like a missing limb restored. He loaded both guns with hands that no longer shook. When he stepped out of the barn, Lenora was standing in the yard. Behind her, 3 men from neighboring homesteads had arrived, drawn by the commotion, alerted by a boy who had seen the riders from the hill. They were farmers, not fighters. Their hands held pitchforks and old hunting rifles. Their faces held fear. Elias looked at them. Then he looked at the valley stretching east, where somewhere in the fading light, a 9-year-old girl was crying for her mother. "I'm going to get her back," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just a statement of fact, the way a man might say the sun will rise. One of the farmers stepped forward. "You can't fight a dozen men alone." Elias checked the cylinder of his Colt. "I don't plan to fight alone," he said. I plan to show you how." That night, Elias stood in the center of the Pebble Creek church with the weight of the room pressing against him. Every man in the community had come. Farmers, shopkeepers, the blacksmith, the preacher, even old Jasper, whose hands still shook from his encounter with Decker Flint. They sat in the pews and looked at the stranger they had laughed at, the man they had called Spineless, the vagrant they had watched kneel in the dirt and assumed was nothing. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not deliver a speech. He spoke the way he always did, quiet and direct, like each word had been weighed before it left his mouth. "Decker Flint has been bleeding this countryside for 3 years," he said. "He took cattle from the Coulters. He took horses from the Harwick Ranch. He took a child from her mother, and he will keep taking until there is nothing left." He paused. "Let the silence do its work. Every one of you has lost something. Some of you have lost livestock. Some have lost money. Some have lost your nerve. He counts on that. He counts on you being too afraid to stand, because standing means risking what little you have left." His eyes moved across the room, steady as a lantern in still air. "But the truth is this. You've already lost what you are afraid of losing. The moment you let a man like Flint ride into your town and take whatever he wants, you have already lost everything. The cattle, the money, those can be replaced. But the moment your children look at you and see a man who did nothing, that is the thing you cannot get back." The room was silent. A man in the back cleared his throat. "And who are you to tell us this? You showed up here with nothing." Elias unbuttoned his coat and let them see the twin Colts on his hips. The room inhaled. "My name is Elias Cade," he said. The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of recognition. 2 of the older men straightened in their seats. Jasper's mouth fell open. The name Elias Cade was not famous the way politicians or generals were famous. It was famous the way storms were famous. People did not celebrate it. They survived it. "You are the ghost of Redwater," Jasper whispered. "I was," Elias said. "Now I'm the man who is going to bring that girl home. And I need 10 men willing to ride with me. Not soldiers, not gunslingers. Just men who remember what it feels like to protect something worth keeping." The silence stretched. Then the blacksmith, a broad man named Holt with arms like fence posts, stood from his pew. "I'll ride." A farmer named Ellis stood next. Then another. And another. By the time the night was over, 14 men had volunteered. Elias spent the next 6 hours in the barn, planning. He drew a map of Eagle Pass from memory. He had ridden through that country years ago, chasing a bounty who tried to lose himself in the canyons. He knew the mining camp. He knew the approaches. He knew where the sentries would be posted. He assigned positions like a general preparing for battle. 2 men on the north ridge with rifles, 3 at the canyon mouth, 4 approaching from the creek bed, and Elias himself would go straight through the front. Lenora found him in the barn just before midnight, loading rifles by lantern light. "You don't have to do this," she said, though her voice said the opposite. He looked up. "Yes, I do." She stepped closer. "Come back," she whispered. "Both of you, come back." He reached for her hand. Her fingers were cold. He held them until they warmed. "I will bring her home," he said. "I promise you that on every breath I have left." She pressed her forehead against his chest and stayed there for a long moment. Then she stepped back, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and walked out. Elias watched her go. Then he turned back to the rifles and finished loading. At dawn, 15 men rode east toward Eagle Pass. The sun rose red behind them, and the valley held its breath. They reached the canyon by late afternoon. Eagle Pass was a wound in the earth, a narrow slash of red rock and shadow that swallowed sound and sunlight in equal measure. The old mining camp sat at the bottom, a cluster of collapsed timber structures and rusted equipment that had been abandoned decades ago. Smoke rose from 3 separate fires. Horses were tied along a rope line near the creek, and through the gap in the rocks Elias could see them. Decker Flint's men moved through the camp with the lazy arrogance of men who had never been challenged. Some played cards, some cleaned weapons. 2 stood guard at the mouth of the canyon, rifles across their laps, and in the center of the camp, tied to a post outside the largest structure, sat Bertie. Her face was streaked with dirt and dried tears. Her dress was torn at the hem. but she was alive, and she was not crying. She sat with her back straight and her chin lifted, and even from a distance, Elias could see the defiance in her posture. Elias positioned his men the way he had planned, 2 on the north ridge with the best rifles, their job to take the sentries first, 3 at the canyon mouth to block any escape, 4 along the creek bed, moving slow through the brush, and 5 with Elias, approaching from the south where the rock wall had crumbled enough to create a narrow passage. He looked at each man before they separated. These were not soldiers. Their hands trembled, their breathing was too fast, but their eyes were steady. He spoke once, quietly. "No man rides back without the child. That is the only thing that matters today." They nodded. Then they moved. The first shot came from the ridge, clean and precise. The sentry at the canyon mouth dropped without a sound. The second shot followed half a breath later. The second sentry crumpled. The camp exploded into chaos. Decker's men scrambled for weapons, shouting, cursing, knocking over card tables and fire pits. The men from the creek bed opened fire from the brush, their shots wild but effective in creating panic. Elias moved through the south passage like smoke through cracks. He did not run. He walked. His Colts were drawn, 1 in each hand, and the world narrowed to a corridor of targets and angles. The first man who turned toward him caught a bullet in the shoulder and went down spinning. The second drew and fired wide. Elias did not miss. 3 men fell before the camp understood where he was. By then, the farmers at the canyon mouth had closed the escape route. Decker's men were trapped. Some threw down their weapons. Some tried to fight. Elias reached Bertie in the center of the chaos. She looked up at him with eyes so wide they held the entire sky. "Elias," she whispered. He cut the ropes with his knife. She threw herself against him, and he lifted her with one arm, his other hand still holding a Colt. "Close your eyes," he told her. She pressed her face into his neck and held on. He carried her through the gunfire to the creek bed, where Holt the blacksmith waited with a horse. "Take her," Elias said. "Ride west. Don't stop until you reach the ranch." Holt took the child and rode. Bertie's voice carried back through the canyon. "Come back, Elias. You promised." He turned back toward the camp. Decker Flint was still standing. Decker stood in the center of the ruined camp, his men scattered and fallen around him. His coat was torn. Blood ran from a cut above his eye, but his hands held his revolver steady, and his pale eyes found Elias through the smoke and dust. "Cade," he said. The name fell from his lips like a curse. "I heard you were dead." "Not yet," Elias answered. They faced each other across 30 feet of dirt and smoke. The canyon walls rose around them like the ribs of something ancient and watching. Decker smiled, the scar pulling his face into something grotesque. "You killed my brother. Your brother drew first." "Doesn't matter." Decker raised his gun. Elias was faster. He had always been faster. The shot echoed through Eagle Pass and bounced off the canyon walls until it sounded like thunder rolling through the bones of the earth. Decker Flint fell. He did not get up. The canyon went quiet. The smoke drifted. And somewhere to the west, a little girl was riding home. The ride back to Pebble Creek took 2 days. The men rode slow, battered and exhausted, their horses lathered and weary. They brought with them everything Decker Flint had stolen, cattle that had been taken from 4 different communities, strong boxes of coin and currency, horses branded with marks from ranches across the territory, and 3 other children taken from families in neighboring valleys who had been held in a root cellar beneath the mining camp for weeks. The men of Pebble Creek rode in silence for most of the journey. They were not the same men who had left. Something had shifted in them, something quiet but permanent. They had stood when it mattered. They had fought for something beyond themselves, and that knowledge settled into their bones like iron forged in fire. When the riders crested the final ridge and the valley spread before them, the town was waiting. Women and children lined the road. Lenora stood at the front, her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes searching the column of riders for 2 faces. Bertie sat on Holt's horse, wrapped in a blanket, her hair tangled but her eyes bright. When she saw her mother, she screamed, not in fear, but in the purest expression of joy a child can make. Holt lowered her to the ground, and she ran. Lenora dropped to her knees and caught her daughter in her arms with a force that nearly knocked them both into the dust. They held each other so tightly that the world around them disappeared. Lenora's shoulders shook. Bertie buried her face in her mother's neck and repeated one word over and over. Mama, mama, mama. Elias dismounted at the edge of the crowd. He did not walk forward. He stood by his horse, one hand on the saddle, watching the reunion from a distance. The town looked at him differently now. The boy who had thrown the stone weeks ago stood in the crowd, his hat in his hands, his face flushed with shame. Old Jasper walked toward Elias and extended his hand. Elias shook it. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The stolen cattle were returned. The money was distributed back to the families it had been taken from. The 3 rescued children were reunited with their parents in scenes that broke every heart that witnessed them. The men who had ridden to Eagle Pass were celebrated not as heroes, but as neighbors who had remembered what neighbors were supposed to do. That evening, Elias stood by the corral at the Harwick Ranch, watching the sun bleed gold across the valley. Lenora approached him slowly, Bertie asleep inside. She stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "The town council wants to make you sheriff," she said. He almost laughed. "I'm not a lawman. You're the closest thing this valley has ever had to one." He shook his head. "I'm just a ranch hand." She turned to face him. Her eyes were red from crying, but steady. "You are not just anything, Elias Cade. You are the man who brought my daughter home. You are the man who taught this town to stand, and you are the man who sits on my porch every evening and makes me feel like I am not carrying this life alone." She reached up and placed her hand against his face. His jaw tightened beneath her palm. "Stay," she said. One word, the same word he had heard from Bertie, the same word he had been afraid to say to himself. He looked at her. The woman who had pulled him from the dirt when the world had stepped over him, the woman who had given him work, a roof, and something far more dangerous, a reason to care again. He took her hand from his face and held it. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Behind them, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Inside, Bertie slept with a wooden horse tucked beneath her arm and a drawing of 3 figures pressed against her heart. Outside, the valley stretched wide and silent under a sky thick with stars. The wind moved through the grass like a hymn played on the oldest instrument in the world. And Elias Cade, the man they had laughed at, the stranger they had called Spineless, the ghost who had laid down his guns and picked them up one final time, stood in the quiet of a place that finally felt like it belonged to him. Not because he had earned it with bullets, but because he had earned it with something harder: patience, gentleness, and the courage to love again when love was the most dangerous thing he had ever done. The end.